So, to complement my earlier reaction, which some of you may or may not have seen, I did a movie reaction to the Zulu 1964 film, and so now I'm going to be watching Extra History's Zulu Empire little mini series to quickly get a better scope of the Zulu people and exactly, what made them great, because I had heard since the reaction that they actually had an empire and were incredibly, they were expanding very fast, so I'm really looking forward. And apparently I do know Shaka Zulu from the epic rap battles of history video, Shaka Zulu versus Julius Caesar, so that apparently he gets stabbed by his siblings. I think that was like a lyric or something like that, or was that a comment? I forgot, but either way, I could have sworn that that's something that happened. If I'm wrong, well, I'm about to find out. So, yeah, if you want to watch the original video by Extra History, the link is down in the description down below. And if you enjoy my channel and you want to help me out in any way, shape, or form, feel free to please like, comment, subscribe, and maybe consider becoming a member. It's only for $1 a month, and it would really help me out a lot. Now, with that said, and now without any further ado, let's do. Gosh darn it.
For the next few weeks, we'll be covering the Zulu Empire, its rise, its fall, and its famous fight against the British. We'll see a small tribe become an empire. We'll see European factions playing out the game of power on South African shores, and we'll see a late post-Napoleonic army, well-drilled and equipped with modern rifles, be beaten by an indigenous population wielding nothing more than spears and hide shields. But before we can do so, we need to talk about sources. There's a lot about this period that we just don't know. It's not like the Sengoku Jidai, where it's simply hard to find translations of the more obscure records. In this case, we're dealing with a culture that didn't keep written records, so all we have to go on are scant accounts from European traders, and oral histories collected decades after the fact. Much of what we're gonna tell you, especially about the early period we're covering, are best guesses by the historians and archaeologists who have worked tirelessly to piece together the puzzle of exactly what transformed the Zulus, a tribe perhaps as small as 1,500 people living in an area probably around 10 square miles, into an empire of 250,000 people,
Holy crap.
ruling over an area roughly the size of New Jersey. So, with that caveat, let's start laying out the background. Who were the Zulu people when this all began? What did life look like for them? How did they subsist? What was their government, their economy, their military? Well, they were a relatively minor tribe within the larger Bantu people, who occupied a region in what would now be the eastern part of South Africa. They had a largely pastoral economy, with wealth being measured in cattle, and the population mostly subsisting on maize and milk. They operated under a kingship, but they had very little in the way of what we would consider centralized governance. And war? Well, when our story begins, somewhere in the end of the 18th century, warfare in this region was more of a ritual affair than a destructive endeavor. Warriors would meet at a predetermined location and fling spears and insults at one another, but would rarely move in for close quarters fighting. This left the casualties very light, and it was almost unheard of for the winning side to follow up a victory by chasing down their opponents or sacking or conquering their land. Instead, battles would result in the transfer of a small amount of territory.
You know what that kind of reminds me of? It reminds me of, like, it has some similarities to, like, ancient Greek warfare, where, like, pre-Alexander and I think, like, later on the classical era, it was more like, where, like, it was almost sportsmanship, like, where the two Greek armies, I don't think they had, like, standing armies as we would know them later on. Like, they would just kind of, assemble their guys, each city-state, meet at a predetermined location, fight, and even their phalanx fighting. The classical Greek phalanx was described more as a push rather than the Macedonian phalanx. They would kind of push each other until one side would come out on top, and then usually the casualties emerged from whichever side broke first and fled. It was sort of sportsmanship-like in some ways, that the wars there. And I guess this is different, though. This is more projectile throwing than stuff. But yeah, just something like that. Like when their versions of war can almost seem like, yeah, kind of ritualistic or sportsmanship, then I think the war we're more accustomed to.
Or some cattle. But Shaka, who will be the central figure in the early part of our story, changed all this. He changed the weapons, the tactics, and perhaps most importantly, the philosophy of war in the region. He brought in close quarters combat, replacing the traditional long throwing spear with a shorter thrusting spear that was devastating when used in a melee. He developed a system of envelopment tactics known as the bullhorn formation, which I'll explain in more detail later.
Yeah, well, after watching the Zulu movie reaction we did a few weeks back, yeah, I was really shocked to see that, yeah, the Zulus use envelopment tactics. Essentially, the bull's horn, as it was explained in the movie, the horn side would essentially go and just surround an enemy when they were lured by, like, what, the head or loin, as I think it was called. It was really interesting, and I guess it is innovative for the time because it doesn't seem like the neighboring groups to the Zulus seem to, their idea of war is just the meeting, right, and the flinging of spears. Meanwhile, this is an actual, like, straight up envelopment designed to destroy. It's close quarter. It's, so yeah, this would be incredibly innovative, right, to the fellow Africans and devastating to the enemy. It is interesting how Europe and, like, the East, kind of that region from, like, Europe all the way to, like, Asia, kind of developed incredibly quick when it came to warfare. Meanwhile, other continents, sort of like the American continent and bits of Africa, definitely were centuries, behind. But it is something I have been taking notice of and been really fascinated. Especially Europe, especially later on. Europe, like, advanced really quickly, faster than other places when it came to war. So yeah, I don't know. I always find that development super fascinating.
And he changed war from a means of settling minor disputes to an activity of slaughter and conquest. So who was Shaka? Shaka was the eldest son of the leader of the Zulu people, but he was considered illegitimate, and so wasn't named the heir to the Zulu kingdom. In fact, his name, Shaka, means intestinal beetle, which was sort of the cover story for his mother's untimely pregnancy. This becomes kind of hilarious when you realize that we in the West often call him Shaka Zulu, and since the word Zulu actually means heaven in the Zulu language, we're basically calling him intestinal beetle heaven. So enjoy that.
I love that. I actually was a big nerd for, like, name meanings. Like, my name, for instance, Edwin, means rich friend. So, which, I don't know, I've always been kind of like a big nerd for names and their meanings and stuff. So I do like learning about that.
Anyway, at the age of 7, because of his illegitimacy, Shaka was sent to live with his mother among the Ilangeni, a neighboring tribe. From there, he moved on to the Matetwa, the most powerful tribe in the region, where he served as a warrior first for a man named Job, and then for Job's successor, a man named Dingiswayo. Dingiswayo took notice of Shaka's unusual prowess as a close combat fighter, and when he discovered that Shaka was actually of royal blood, put him in charge of an ibuto, which you can basically think of as a regiment. And it's here that Shaka really began to refine his tactics. The traditional ibuto were armed with long throwing spears, and while they practiced the use of their weapons, they didn't do much in terms of practicing unit tactics. Generally, they would show up to the battlefield as more of a loose mob than a cohesive fighting unit. But Shaka began to experiment with this. He armed his men with the short stabbing spear, and drilled them in a tactic that he called the bullhorn. He'd split his men into 3 groups: the chest, the horns, and the loins. The chest would charge the enemy and pin them in hand-to-hand combat. Then the 2 branches of the horns, positioned to either side of the chest, would flank and envelop the pinned enemy. This whole time, the loins would sit behind the lines, acting as a rested reserve to be applied where needed. Interestingly, it's been said that Shaka would have these men sit with their backs to the fighting, so they wouldn't become panicked or charge over-eagerly before he needed them. The brilliance of this system was that it was simple. Without much battlefield coordination...
Yeah, again, if you look at other parts in the world, yeah, envelopment tactics and stuff has already kind of been evolved, like, probably, like, upper North Africa and, like, Europe and stuff, so... I remember kind of reading a comment in regards to, like, the Zulu tactics after watching the movie, kind of like, someone really put it into words, like, yeah, this sounds simple when you think of, like, other places that were more developed in war, aka Europe and stuff. But like this was super innovative for here, this region, right? Where war wasn't and technology wasn't as advanced. So this is like their first steps into a much more complicated thing, and that this was, you know, very innovative for here. And it is true though, like again, instead of like a mob, a loose form mob or whatever, the more ritualistic fighting was, this is straight up like designed for destruction and killing to be maximized. And it really is cool. Like I said, envelopment tactics. My favorite battlefield commander of all time is Hannibal Barca. You know, and he was the master of envelopment. So it is really cool to see that. That's really what caught my eye when we were watching the film.
Every man knew what he was supposed to do. If you're in the chest, you charge. If you're in the horns, you get around their flank. The system's simplicity meant that it could be applied in chaotic conditions without much of the signaling that was required by modern armies. With these deadly new weapons and tactics, Shaka became a force to be reckoned with. And when his father died, he decided it was time to take his own. Shaka's half-brother, the legitimate heir, took the Zulu throne, but with the help of Dingiswayo, Shaka quickly had him assassinated and simply moved in to take over the place. Dingiswayo was still the chief of the Zulus, so Shaka continued to serve him, but only a year later, Dingiswayo was killed by a man named Zwide, the ruler of the Ndwandwe, one of the most powerful tribes in the region. Shaka vowed vengeance for his leader's death, and stepped in to fill the void Dingiswayo had left behind, bringing the Mtetwa, and with them many of the other local tribes, under his control. Shaka's vengeance and the war he was about to bring would lead to a period of unparalleled chaos and devastation. In Zulu, they call it the Mefakane. In English, we simply call it the crushing.
Dang.
But before we delve into the crushing, we should talk about why war here became genocide, and why the region was so primed to explode at the first signs of strife. A lot of it has to do with European influence. Not because Europeans tried to cause it, in fact there were many Europeans who tried to help, but given how radically different, how wealthy, how technologically separated the Europeans were from the local population, their mere presence dramatically destabilized the region. As European trade increased, new crops were introduced, which led to a population increase, which in turn led to greater competition for land. Meanwhile, European ships would trade for cattle to resupply their food stores, which made cattle even more valuable and led to an increase in raiding. At the same time, European traders also came looking for ivory, and to get ivory, you have to take down elephants, which requires a large degree of coordination from a group of people, which some have said led to the more coordinated and far more deadly tactics that Shaka was able to implement. To add to all of this, a drought caused the more water-hungry European crops to fail, which led to a famine. So the area, Natal, was already primed for disaster. Join us next week as we explore...
Okay, so yeah, the European... I mean, there is some benefits to the European intervention. At least, like, yeah, I guess if you view population increase as a good thing, but then again, it also comes with its stuff. But, like, you know, some innovation stuff, but it also... Yeah, also leads to, obviously, more competition, more, yeah, I could see, like, how all that just led to that. Okay, part 2. Gosh darn it.
Last we left off, Shaka's boss, Dingiswayo, had just been killed at the hands of a man named Zwide. Shaka had declared vengeance against Zwide and his clan, the Ndwandwe, and the Zulu had moved from being a tribe to a fledgling empire, as Shaka consolidated control over the Mtetwa, Dingiswayo's powerful clan. Today we look into the war between Shaka and Zwide, and the disaster that followed in its wake. As Shaka took control of the Mtetwa tribe, he began to spread his ideas amongst them, teaching them how to fight in Zulu fashion, and having them take on the Zulu name. He instilled in this newly consolidated Zulu clan a warrior culture that had never existed before, and changed them from being pastoral herdsmen to conquerors. With this, Shaka began his frequently brutal expansion outward, bringing in neighboring tribes with diplomacy when possible, but often resorting to the extremities of force. Unlike the ritual warfare of old, when his forces would engage an enemy band, their goal was to destroy the enemy completely. And when the forces under arms were destroyed, he would march into the enemy village, often killing all the men of fighting age, assimilating only the women and children into the Zulu tribe. Finally, after training his people and expanding his
I always
reach,
do like when we cover stories that where like things are like in areas that are a bit more divided, not as advanced, but then like some guy will come along and unite everybody and then turn a group of people that are more like herdsmen or have these other occupations into just a straight up efficient army. I think of Genghis Khan a lot, right? And like how he turned the steppes into a literal world terror. Um, through the Mongols, and then you kind of have that example. It kind of gives me that kind of vibe, you know. Um, or like how the Arabian Peninsula was, united by Islam and then went on to take on both Rome and the Persians. So it's always cool to see like a group of people just kind of like unify, lock in, and just start expanding. Like we've seen some stuff like shades of this, like I said, with the Mongols and the Arabs. So it's always, I find this fascinating when we see like the development of like groups like this.
Shaka felt ready to take on Zuide. As Zuide's Ndwandwe forces pushed their way into what was now Zulu territory, Shaka ran a number of delaying tactics along the Umfolozi River while he moved his people and his cattle out of harm's way. Then he arrayed his forces, about 5,000 strong, on a hill, right in the path of the oncoming Ndwandwe army. To the Ndwandwe, this looked like an easy victory. They had more than twice as many men as Shaka could muster, and never before had one of the Zulu armies really been able to stand against them. Shaka, seeing his disadvantage in numbers, split a small contingent from his force, and used it to lure off a sizable portion of the enemy's army. But the Ndwandwe coming toward the hill still outnumbered him. This actually turned into an advantage for Shaka, though. The Ndwandwe forces got in each other's way as they tried to clamber up the hill in a disorganized mob. This disorder, combined with the uphill ascent, made the long throwing spears the Ndwandwe carried useless.
Dang.
The Zulu countercharged, rushing downhill and crashing into the enemy line with their short stabbing spears. The enemy routed, stampeding back down the hill. Shaka gathered his men back into formation at the top of the hill and waited. 5 times that day, the Ndwandwe charged the hill, and 5 times they were repulsed by the smaller force. As the day wore on, the Ndwandwe began
the high ground advantage. There's always why there's an example of why they say fighting an uphill battle is a bad thing, and this is a good example of that, right? They're throwing spear, like, yeah, I imagine throwing your spear up is probably not as easy. So again, natural terrain and it can play a big part in battles, and it seems like Shaka seemed to realize that to some degree.
suffer from that great bane of armies in tropical climes, the heat. Ndwandwe men started to slip off to the river about a mile away. Meanwhile, every time the Ndwandwe fell back, the Zulu warriors refreshed themselves with supplies Shaka had hidden atop the hill. The day was going well for Shaka, but even with his successes, his force was still outnumbered. Then, Shaka saw a signal fire in the distance. The diversionary force he had used to lure away a column of the Ndwandwe were letting him know that the contingent chasing them were on their way back. Shaka didn't have much time. He needed to shatter the Ndwandwe before the rest of their forces returned. But even though Zuide's men had been beaten back time and again, they had taken a toll on the Zulus' numbers. Seeing this, Zuide marshaled his troops and prepared to lead them personally in one last grand assault. But Shaka was ready for it. All day, this entire time, he had only been fighting with 2/3 of his men,
Oh, wow.
the chest and horns of his bull's horn strategy. The other third, the loins, had been hidden in a depression behind...
This is the importance of having reserves, bro. When the enemy army is fully committed, they exhaust themselves. But if you have reserves, as we've seen a lot of times in history, the army that usually has the reserves the last usually will come out on top. So this is great. Essentially, yeah, like his innovative idea of having basically reserves seems like it's going to pay dividends.
the hill, rested and fresh. Now he called on them to join the horns and envelop the enemy. Seeing this large force appear as if from nowhere, the Ndwandwe began to panic. Pinned by the chest and encircled by the horns, this last column of Ndwandwe was crushed, with its tattered remnants fleeing down the hill. Shaka sent a small contingent of men to kill any Ndwandwe they could find taking water at the river, while his main force pursued the bulk of the fleeing army. But as the Ndwandwe column that had followed his diversionary force began to close in, Shaka was forced to give up the chase. The day was a bloody one. As was common in this new style of war, neither side took prisoners. As the sun set, nearly 2,000 Zulus lay dead, as did 7,500 Ndwandwe
Dang.
troops. But their leader, Zwide, was not among them. Zwide was not well liked among the nearby tribes, and as cracks in the mighty Ndwandwe army began to show, Shaka was able to gain new allies and new client states for his confederacy, bolstering his numbers. After 18 more months of minor skirmishes, the final battle between the two forces came at the Mahlatuzi River. As the Ndwandwe forces were trying to cross, the Zulu engaged, trapping half their forces on each side. Over the course of 2 days of running battle, the Ndwandwe forces were scattered. Seeing his opportunity, Shaka took his forces and marched on the Ndwandwe capital before word of their army's defeat could reach them. As he approached, before his men were close enough to be seen clearly from the capital, he had them start to sing Ndwandwe victory songs. Upon hearing the singing, the populace rushed out to greet them, only to be slaughtered by the oncoming
Holy
forces.
crap. Yeah, he ain't above, like, kind of trickery in that regard, huh? Holy crap. Yeah, you're starting to see the brutality going on. Like, he's mentioning how more bloody things are escalating. Like, before, casualties were low in the more ritualistic fighting of old, but now it's, like, straight up, like, more war as we're kind of used to now, right? Like, yeah, this is meant to be bloody and just kill everyone. Oh my gosh.
Zwide managed to escape, but his mother did not. Shaka locked her in a house with jackals and hyenas to eat her alive, and when the night was done, he had the house burnt to the ground so only ash would remain.
Oh, that's brutal. Yeah, Shaka Zulu can be super brutal. Oh my goodness.
Over the coming years, Shaka continued to expand his reach and assert Zulu dominance over all the tribes in the area. He turned his confederacy into a true empire, and exerted influence far beyond even the regions he could control. But all those tribes he had pushed out, all the fleeing refugees he had left behind, all the warriors he had driven from their homes, spread out like a fire across the savannah. All those men who had seen the Zulu fight adopted the Zulu way of war, and as they fled the now mighty Zulu, they inflicted the same brutality on those around them. This was the Mefakane, the crushing. These tribes that fled the Zulu either died out or formed kingdoms of their own with the same bloody tactics they had learned from the Zulu, and at an incredible price. Over the next 15 years...
Yeah, it makes sense. Like, when we see that in military, like, the thing about, like, war is that it's a constant evolution. It always keeps growing, and that when a new innovative tactic or maneuver or way of fighting is introduced, usually everyone's gonna copy it eventually, especially if it's successful, you know, like, when it comes to weaponry, tactics, like think of, like, Napoleon, for instance, introducing the core system, and then everyone else starts using it. It's a constant evolution, and so it only makes sense, like, yeah, the other African groups would see that what's working for the Zulu and literally do it the same way, which will in turn keep creating more blood and just a cycle, right? That's like, yeah, it is tragic, but you know, like they say, war, it never changes.
Well over 1 million people would die as these refugees from the Zulu cut their way across the southern half of Africa. But by 1827, not all was right in the Zulu kingdom. Shaka's mother, the parent who had raised him, died, and he went mad with grief. Sources report him ordering that no grain be planted for a year, that any woman who got pregnant was to be executed along with her husband, that milk was not to be gathered from their cattle. It said that he had 7,000 people killed for not grieving enough, that he had cows slaughtered so that their calves would know what it was like to lose a mother. It goes without saying that shortly after this, he was assassinated by his brother.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. I thought it was more like a tragic thing, like, you know, like, oh, maybe they were just super ambitious and wanted to kill him, but, like, honestly, seeing that, I can kind of get why they did that. That sucks, dude. Like, I can't imagine losing my mom. I would be devastated. Granted, I wouldn't, like, start killing people, but, like, yeah. I guess literally mad with grief, huh?
They'd been trying to get rid of him for some time anyway.
Never
but
mind.
as so often happens with these things, his two brothers shortly became one brother, as there's just not enough room for two on the throne. And so, with two brothers bumped off in short succession, a man named Dingane became the leader of the Zulu Empire. After either bribing or killing anybody still loyal to Shaka, Dingane faced a new threat. Dutch settlers, pushed east by the British colonial efforts in South Africa, began to enter Zulu land. At first, relations appeared cordial, with the Dutch helping to recover some 7,000 cattle from Dingane's enemies in return for land in the Zulu territory. But when the Dutch came to Dingane's capital to sign the agreement, in the midst of a ceremonial dance, Dingane shouted to have them seized and dragged off to a nearby hill, where they were all clubbed to
Holy
death.
crap.
Dingane then sent troops off to massacre the now undefended Dutch wagon train. As is so often the case, none of this ends well for anybody. The Dutch sent out another
Yeah, what's with the sudden switch up? I thought they were kind of getting along, but it seems like he just had a sudden switch up. Like, you know what? Kill them. Like, huh. I wonder what led him to having that switch up. Maybe just he doesn't like outside interference, but I wonder what was going through his mind in that change.
wagon train, but this one full of nothing but fighters.
Oh boy.
In what's now known as the Battle of Bloody River, over 10,000 Zulus attacked the circled wagons of the Dutch, but with only their short spears to fight with and on poor terrain, funneled into a killing plain. 3,000 Zulus lay dead by the end of the day, and only 3 of the Dutch were even wounded.
Oh my.
This battle broke the back of Dingane's forces. The last remaining half-brother of Dingane, who had fled with thousands of his followers after seeing how Dingane treated the rest of his relatives, now came storming back, and the Dutch immediately became his allies. In the end, he crushed Dingane, and he himself took over the leadership of the Zulu. He established a wary peace with the Dutch settlers, granting them land in return for their aid, and began his reign in relative tranquility. Next week, we'll find out just how that...
Alright, let's jump. How many parts are there? Right, just making sure. Yeah, but very smart to use the Dutch in that regard, but like, it's kind of... You see, I've seen times in this or situations similar to this where you kind of accept outside help from stronger people, but usually it kind of leads to more of that outside influence increasing, if that makes sense. Like, he's kind of opened the door for the Europeans. I mean, granted, though, I don't think they were gonna go anyways, but you know what I mean? Kind of opened the door, and that could either go really well or really bad in the long run, as probably more European encroachment is gonna increase by doing that.
Last week, we saw the fall of Shaka. We saw Dingane meet his end at the hands of his half-brother, Mapande, and we saw the Zulu and the Dutch come to an uneasy truce when Mapande allied with them to overthrow his brother. This week, we'll see how European and native relations evolve as the 19th century moves on. But before we can talk about how the Europeans and the indigenous peoples of South Africa interacted, we have to take a closer look at the Europeans who were there. Who were they? Why were they there? What relation did they have to one another? Well, this isn't quite as straightforward as you might think. The two principal powers at play here were the English and the Dutch, but why they're both there and who they're loyal to is about to get complicated. You see, back in 1652, the Dutch, under the Dutch East India Company, first settled Cape Town and sort of lay claim to South Africa. But that was like 150 years before our story started. We're looking at the late 18th and early 19th century here. And what was happening in Europe in the late 18th and early 19th century? Right, Napoleon. During the French Revolution, French armies conquered the Dutch Republic, and the ruler of the Dutch Republic, the Prince of Orange, fled to Britain and asked them to take over his colonies so they wouldn't fall into the hands of the rampaging French. This left the Dutch in South Africa in a strange state of limbo. They were now ruled by the British, but were citizens of a nation which no longer existed, and might never come back for them. Many of the Dutch colonists chafed under British rule, and as the British began to expand their colonial efforts far more actively than the Dutch ever had, Dutch settlers began to move into the previously uncolonized interior of the country to escape British expansion. And in doing so, they started to see themselves as independent, neither British nor Dutch, but rather as a part of their own South African nation, who I'm going to refer to as the Boers from now on, since that's how they referred to themselves. As they moved inland, the Boers began to set up their own republics on native territory, often Zulu territory.
That's really interesting, that they've just decided to kind of form their own... I'm not sure they see themselves as a nation, more just as an independent group, but like, obviously it's gonna keep growing, right? I wonder if, like... Oh, we'll see, but that's a very interesting dilemma. They don't really have anywhere else to go now, right? So... Yeah, I don't see them leaving Zulu territory.
conflicts created tension in the region that would eventually escalate to the extremity of violence. But for right now, European politics in South Africa really was a matter of the British wanting to limit the power and influence of the Boers, and the Boers wanting to assert their independence and ensure that the British didn't eventually assimilate all of South Africa. But the Boers were limited in number. They weren't exactly getting a large influx of immigrants from the country they'd declared independence from, and South Africa wasn't a primary British concern. So who did the Boers try to use as both pawns and proxies for their struggle? The local people, the Zulus. Okay, so back to the Zulus. Mapande is usually considered a weak king. I think this might be a little unfair, but he was certainly less warlike than his relatives. He negotiated a treaty defining borders with the British, and then gave additional lands to the Boers. But the British weren't just going to let the Boers expand, so this is where the British really started to encroach on Zulu sovereignty. They claimed that the land given to the Boers was in violation of the treaty the Zulus had made with them, and pressured Mapande into retaking the area. Thereafter, Mapande attempted to navigate the tightrope of keeping both the Boers and the British happy, but he knew he'd need a buffer between him and the Europeans. So, in the 1850s, he decided to launch an invasion into Swaziland to secure himself from Boer encroachment. The British, though, saw this expansion as a threat, and once again forced him out of his gains, compelling him to abandon the territory he'd just won. During this campaign in Swaziland, it became very clear that Mapande's son, Cetshwayo...
Yeah, this is the king who was depicted in the Zulu movie. Yeah, this is quite the awful situation. How many Boers are there, though? Like, that's what I'm wondering. Are they enough? I mean, obviously, they don't. He mentioned they don't have, like, a lot of numerical superiority, but I guess if they have modern weaponry, they can still make them dangerous to the Zulus. But, like, I'm wondering how many of the Boers, you know, there were in that regard. And but we do know that the British Empire is on the rise, so they're a threat. Yeah, I don't really envy him in that position, right? It seems like almost inevitable that you're gonna anger one group, and it almost like you're gonna have to kind of sort of fight. Though I think the course they took is against the British rather than the Boers.
Was a vigorous and capable leader. And here something strange happens. Cetshwayo just sort of slides into power without killing Mapande. That's not to say that there was no violence. After all, one of Mapande's other sons was also jockeying for power, as the Zulus became less content with Mapande's concessions to the British. Cetshwayo invaded the other son's territory and defeated both him and a small contingent of his British allies. Remarkably, he let the British go, and began a new diplomatic policy that aimed at keeping peace with both the colonial powers while giving far less away to the Europeans than Mapande had. Then, somebody discovered diamonds in the area.
No.
This always screws things up. European miners started pouring...
Yeah, this is the equivalent of when, like, America hears a nation has oil, you know? I'm joking, but you know, it's kind of that idea, right? Like, you hear, ooh, natural resources, don't mind if I do. Like, you know, oh boy. Yeah, it seems like, okay, I'll make peace with you guys, but I'm gonna actually have a backbone and be like, you're not getting land. I mean, that could backfire, I could see that. But, like, I guess trying to be more assertive, at least making the effort. But yeah, now I can see how this changes everything.
South Africa, and with them, shopkeepers, tool traders, geologists, and all the other support personnel that a major mineral rush needs. But it was never enough. The demand for labor outpaced even the flood of fortune seekers coming to South Africa, and so the European mining firms began to look hungrily at the native population. For the most part, the Zulus and the surrounding tribes were content. Working a diamond mine is unpleasant. The Zulu already had all they needed with their farms and their cattle, and now with all these essentially unproductive Europeans flooding in, the Zulu could get a pretty good price for any surplus food they grew. This led mining conglomerates to offer guns for labor, and the British government to start taking more drastic steps toward expansion. The British wanted to secure any potential diamond mines they could, which meant pushing into native and Boer territory at an unheard-of rate. At the same time, the British also wanted to start consolidating their hold over South Africa in general, and to integrate the outlying tribes with the growing diamond economy. Doing this basically meant destroying the traditional South African way of life, and stepping on agreements made with the Boers. But the funny thing is, while the British government wanted to make all this happen, their local South African ruling government, especially in Cape Town, wanted nothing to do with it. Britain needed to bring them in line. Thus enters Henry Bartle Frere. Frere had once been an ardent civil servant for the British in India. He had done notable service during the Indian Rebellion, and had risen to be governor of Bombay. He'd been noticed by the conservative Secretary of State for the colonies, Lord Carnarvon, whose big project was to confederate many of the British colonies. Carnarvon had just successfully done so with Canada, and now he was dead set on doing the same with South Africa. Carnarvon had Freya appointed High Commissioner of South Africa, and promised that he would become the first Governor-General there, a position that almost certainly came with a peerage, if he could bring the entire area under British control and set up an effective government. Freya agreed, and began to assess what he would need to do in order to achieve this. His solution was basically annex and suppress everybody, but he especially noted the need to break the power of the Zulus. The local political elite tried to warn him that with the recent British expansion, tensions were high, and any minor event might throw the whole region into war. But Freya was having none of that, and began looking for an opportunity to expand. His first chance came from a minor tribal skirmish between two outlying tribes. How minor? Well, it started as a bar fight. That didn't stop Freya from using the incident as cause to declare war on one of the tribes, against the vociferous objections of the local Cape Colony government. The Cape government succeeded in at least making sure that their local fast light commando troops prosecuted the war, rather than the might of the British Royal Army. The war was swift and decisive, but the Cape government had no interest in annexation, and so returned the land to the native people. Freya, furious over this, basically used this act of insubordination to have them effectively removed from power, and have himself granted total governmental control over South Africa. Shortly after this, he enacted a law that demanded that all native Africans had to give up their guns. Not Europeans, mind you, just the native Africans. Well, nobody was falling for that one. The native tribes were far smarter than Freya gave them credit for, and rose in revolt rather than give up their arms. This time, Freya unleashed the mighty British Imperial Army. But, being unfamiliar with the terrain, not accustomed to the weather, and burdened by their heavier armaments, the British army couldn't even find the rebels, much less beat them. Finally, Freya called back in the local frontier commando troops of the Cape Colony government he'd just overthrown, and the commandos managed to engage and defeat some of the rebelling tribesmen. While this allowed Freya to annex their land, it sent much of the rest of South Africa into a guerrilla war that would nearly bankrupt Cape Colony. But this wouldn't stop Bartle Freya. He saw the escalating conflict simply as an expedient. Now, the British government as a whole didn't actually want a war with the native peoples of South Africa, but Carnarvon, who had appointed Freya, was an opponent of the current government, and he did. If the tribes rose up, it made going to war with them and eventually annexing their land much simpler politically. And so, with that in mind, Freya finally went after the crown jewel of South Africa, Zululand. On December 11th, 1878, Freya sent an ultimatum to Cetshwayo, the Zulu king, demanding that he disband his armies entirely and accept a British observer into his court. He gave Cetshwayo 1 month to comply. These demands were impossible. Needless to say, on January 11th, 1879, the British and the Zulu Empire were at war. Join us next time for the Anglo-Zulu...
Yeah, that's very interesting, the whole, we don't want a war, but also we want to expand and, you know, get into diamond things, so it seems like kind of contradictory in a sense that, you know, I think they realize they do kind of have to, at least the ones more closer to South Africa, do probably realize they have to, like, as you mentioned earlier, kind of upheave the way that the South Africans were living in order for this whole diamond thing to, you know, come into fruition. So yeah, it seems like almost in some way inevitable that there would be a conflict, and yeah, essentially that's kind of what they want. It is cool to see that the Cape government seem to have a much more level head and be like, hey, we don't want to, like, you know, actually do this. But again, I guess the higher ups from the British government are like, no, but we do. And yeah, again, they're both brutal empires in a sense. All empires brutal in a sense because they kind of need to expand. You have the Zulus whose empire was forged on a new way of war, a new, more destructive, bloody way. And you also have the British Empire, which we know, you know, can be brutal in their very own way as well. So I don't know, it is, I kind of like what the movie did, is that it showed both sides, but in a very sort of, how do you say, respectful light. Like, you kind of get where both are coming from. You could definitely side with the Zulus because In some sense, Africa is their home. They were there first, but also you can be like, well, they also expanded and were pretty brutal. So again, as with all things, all sides are complicated, and you can find stuff like that, right? So I don't know. I find the whole situation very interesting, and I do really like how the movie, they didn't really try to demonize the Zulus, which could have been super easy to do, like as almost like barbarians or stuff like that, savages. Um, yeah. Overall, this definitely is a very interesting conflict, and I guess kind of goes the course with colonialism, right?
Hey, Indy, great to see you. Welcome to our big, white, empty room. Hey, I've been loving your videos on the Great War channel.
Thanks. I heard you guys were talking about the Zulu Empire, so I figured I'd pop
I don't
over
know
and
who
check
this
it out.
guy is,
Hey,
I'm
did you
sorry.
know that all this stuff leads up to a massive conflict in South Africa during World War I?
Yeah, it's a shame it's so rarely talked about when people discuss the First World War. I mean, even our series here is going to stop at the end of the 1800s. We don't even get to cover the Boer Wars.
No worries. We're actually covering it this week. Come over and visit us if you want to check it out.
Sweet, I will do that. And I'm just going to put up this box here for anybody who wants to come with me.
Ooh.
After this, I mean, I've got an episode.
No, I recognize the Great War. Okay, never mind. Yeah, I watched a video. I think I watched the Balkan Wars video from him.
Whoa, I should be in costume. Last time, we saw Cetshwayo take over the Zulu Empire, witnessed the discovery of diamonds in South Africa, and watched British expansion push the region into anarchy and war. Today, we pick up where we left off, the start of the Anglo-Zulu War. Bartle Frere, the British High Commissioner for South Africa, had just forced the Zulu Empire into war by offering them an ultimatum they could never accept. Cetshwayo and the Zulus prepared for battle, and Lord Chelmsford, the commander-in-chief for the British forces in South Africa, set his men to march. But Lord Chelmsford engaged in a monumental act of underestimation. His greatest worry was that the Zulu wouldn't fight him, so he split his forces into 3 different columns with the idea that he would encircle the Zulu and force them to engage in battle. This was an almost criminal act of disregard. There's essentially no explanation for this, other than that he saw the native forces as fundamentally weak and inferior to European ones. Yes, in the past...
Okay. Maybe... That's very interesting, because we know that the Zulus have developed a way of war. I guess his mindset definitely would be like, well, we're European, we're like, we're pretty advanced in warfare, which in many ways the Europeans are, even at this point, right, with weaponry and, a lot like coming out of the Napoleonic Wars and stuff, and, you know, the British Empire is on the rise, it's going to become the largest empire in the world, so I could honestly see how the arrogance would come, right, and underestimating the Zulus. So that's always a big problem. You never want to underestimate your opponent, even if you think you have it in the bag. We've seen plenty of times where people who have underestimated their foes have often paid for it. And it seems like this will be an example, because I think this was depicted in the Zulu movie, like 1,000 British soldiers were actually killed by the Zulus, and I'm really interested in seeing the explanation of that, because that's the opening scene of the movie, just the aftermath of that battle, you know?
He had encountered native forces that had avoided pitched battle and had fought guerrilla campaigns against him, but simply lumping all the tribes together and assuming that they were alike would be a fatal mistake. After all, even a cursory examination of the Zulu would tell you, they were not exactly ones to shy away from a fight. At first, though, it appeared that Chelmsford may have been right. His columns marched right into Zulu territory only to find it quiet, abandoned. The savannah stretched on, empty. No proud Impi warriors, no Zulu armies, just open grassland. He ordered the 3 columns of his force to split up, with the plan for all of them to converge on the Zulu capital. His main column would march to a place called Isandlwana, where they would establish camp before advancing on the capital itself. When he reached Isandlwana, though, he split his forces again, taking the majority of the troops in his column in search of a Zulu force they believed to be nearby, leaving only a skeleton force of 1,700 men to hold the camp. But as Chelmsford ranged forward, chasing decoys or an illusory Zulu army, the real Zulu force was working their way around his column. On the morning of the 22nd, reports began to filter into camp of a huge Zulu force headed their way. By 10 a.m., the camp commander had sent word of this to Chelmsford, but Chelmsford was convinced that it must be some small diversionary unit, not the main Zulu force. He assumed the people in the camp were just getting jumpy.
Oh no.
At 11 a.m., a party of scouts spotted a small band of Zulus and chased them into a nearby valley, where, to their horror, they saw 20,000 Zulu warriors sitting in utter
Holy
silence.
crap.
Upon being spotted, the Zulu army sprang to life.
Yeah, the Zulus. The movie depicted them as being able to, like, be incredibly quiet and hide really well. It's actually kind of unnerving because they're not a screaming barbaric horde. They're actually incredibly disciplined in many ways of their own, which is really cool to see. Again, I think the movie did good justice in depicting the Zulus, for what I'm getting. And yeah, that's really frightening. Just they managed to move and be quiet despite their great numbers.
With this impossibly large army bearing down on them, the scouts chose one of their number to escape and bring word to the camp. He wheeled his mount around and fled, as the rest of his fellows waged a desperate fighting retreat. The ragged horseman returned to camp and leapt off his horse. The news had gotten through. The camp commander again desperately sent word to Chelmsford calling for rescue, but again, Chelmsford ignored it. Soon, the Zulu army...
Chelmsford, more like Chumpsford, but like, yeah, that was bad, I know. But, yeah, the guy just really, yeah, incompetence is, I think, the appropriate word to use.
Was upon the camp. 20,000 arrayed against 1,800
Oh
defenders.
my gosh.
The British had failed to fortify their camp, not even circling the wagons in the customary makeshift defense. Such defenses were standard operating procedure for the British Army, but Chelmsford hadn't given the order because, by his own words, he felt it would be a waste of time.
Oh my gosh.
The Zulus, though, hadn't prepared to attack the camp this quickly either. They had expected to wait another day, but now that they had been seen, there was only one choice left to them: attack. Luckily, thanks to the bull's horns formation devised by Shaka at the very inception of the Zulu Empire, every Zulu man knew his place. Every man knew what to do. The British camp commander, meanwhile, was really more of an administrator than a soldier. He didn't throw up any last-minute defenses. In fact, he did little more than having his drastically outnumbered men form a line as the Zulu charged. By all accounts, the actual soldiers, the men on both sides, fought heroically. The Zulu charged through the withering hail of rifle fire and artillery. The beleaguered and outnumbered defenders lived up to their training and put up a grim and stoic defense. But as the sky darkened and the sun itself was eclipsed, the guns went silent. The British line was overrun. Desperate last stands continued in pockets across the field, with men fighting back-to-back, swinging rifles and bayonets as ammo ran out. But the day was won. The Zulus had crushed the British defenders. A handful of British soldiers managed to escape Isandlwana, the worst disaster ever inflicted on the Imperial Army by a technologically weaker force, and made their way back to Rorke's Drift, a small hospital...
Yeah, there's a lot of parts that played into that defeat. First off, the incompetence of the leadership, and the ill preparation due to just the underestimating of their enemy, and also just the numbers advantage, there's, again, like, yeah, 1,000 versus 20,000 at once. Like, even with the technological edge, it's just too much. Those numbers are too much,
encampment the advancing army had set up to handle the sick. The survivors, the sick, and those stationed at Rorke's Drift amounted to perhaps 140 British troops, many of whom were members of the Engineering Corps or the Commissariat, rather than the regular infantry. Upon hearing of the disaster at Isandlwana, most of the men's first instinct was to flee, but one man named James Dalton, the acting assistant commissary officer, told them all that they would never outrun a fast-moving Zulu column while burdened with the sick and the wounded. And so, the decision was made. Though victory seemed impossible, they would fight. Unlike the Isandlwana battle, though, these men prepared themselves. Upon hearing of the approaching force, the order was immediately given to use everything they had to fortify Rorke's Drift. Flour bags and biscuit tins were turned into...
Yeah, that's probably the big thing that saved the Rorke's Drift, right? The difference is they actually prepared defensive fortifications, which paid dividends, compared to the other army, which just did not, and was beyond ill-prepared. It's stuff like that that can really make a big difference. And yeah, Rorke's Drift was an amazing last stand. Like, only, 100 British soldiers taking on thousands of Zulus and coming out on top. Really one of the best defensive battles probably of all time.
Walls. Holes were punched in the sides of nearby wooden buildings for shooting through. Hospital beds were turned into barricades, and every soldier who could walk was positioned for the defense. Fortunately for them, the rapidly approaching Zulu force wasn't the same army that had crushed them at Isandlwana, but rather the loins of that force's Bullshorn Formation, the reserve force of 4,000 warriors that hadn't been committed in the main battle. They were commanded by Cetshwayo's half-brother, a less disciplined, rash commander, who had just now violated his orders to simply chase the enemy to the border of Zululand by crossing into British territory to raid Rorke's Drift. Just as the defenses were being completed...
That makes sense. So, like, that wasn't even the full Zulu army. They were facing the reserves of 4,000. And they weren't even supposed to be there in the first place. Oh, wow. Honestly, a blessing for the men of Rorke's Drift, by the way, that the main army did not go there altogether. And that they weren't led by the king. Not to take away from their valiant defense. It's still beyond impressive. Just... yeah, that's also a bit of luck there, right? Like, holy crap, thank God that it wasn't the full 20,000, because, who knows what could have happened, but my goodness.
The Zulu force descended upon Rorke's Drift. For 10 hours, the battle raged, fought inch by inch, room by room. The hospital was burnt to the ground, and the fight was pushed to the cattle pens. But by 2 a.m., it was over. 17 British troops lay dead, and about that many were wounded. But about 800...
Again, only losing 17 guys and taking out 1,000 Zulus, like nearing 1,000, is pretty... that's pretty awesome. Those men were freaking heroes, bro.
150 Zulu were scattered, dead or wounded, on the hospital grounds. Of the 20,000 bullets that had been stored at Rorke's Drift before the encounter, it was later found that only 900 remained unspent. Despite this miraculous last stand at Rorke's Drift, the disaster at Isandlwana and other setbacks meant that the invasion of Zululand was a failure. The British forces withdrew, but Chelmsford, desperate to repair his reputation, immediately began to prepare a second invasion, and the British government, now actively seeking to avoid any further loss of face, rushed in reinforcements and heavier artillery. Cetshwayo attempted to negotiate with the British, knowing this second army to be an overwhelming force, but Chelmsford wouldn't hear of it. With the committed might of the British military at his back, Chelmsford finally attacked the Zulu capital. As the Zulu army lined up for their charge, they saw 10 cannon and 2 Gatling guns arrayed on the other side of the field. Zulu warriors were cut...
oh no. Yeah, just... the Gatling... I mean, already artillery's OP on its own, but the Gatling gun... like, you know. Oh yeah, the Zulus, bro, they don't stand a chance now that the British are locking in.
Down in swaths as they struggled to reach their foe. With this total defeat and the loss of their capital, the Zulu forces simply began to disperse. The mighty Zulu army was no more. The British captured Cetshwayo shortly thereafter, and carved the Zulu kingdom into 13 smaller sub-kingdoms, installing a new ruler into each one. Almost immediately after these kingdoms were created, they fell into conflict, and what can only be called civil war. Cetshwayo, meanwhile, was brought back to England where, surprisingly, he was treated like royalty in exile. He met with Queen Victoria, and his cause was taken up by some of the gentry, to the point where he was eventually returned to the throne of Zululand.
Oh, wow.
Granted, they probably put him there because the Zulu Civil War had gotten out of hand at this point, and they hoped that returning him would reunify the region. Unfortunately, it did not succeed. Shortly after he returned to Zululand, he was attacked by a rival, and died a few months later.
Dang.
He was succeeded by his son, who made great headway in taking back his ancestral claim by allying himself with the Boers, granting the Dutch settlers large swaths of land in return for their help against his rivals. The British definitely couldn't allow that, though. And so, in 1887, British forces finally annexed Zululand for good. And like that, the Zulu Empire was snuffed out.
Dang. Yeah, that's a good example of colonialism at effect. Again, it is interesting to see. There are parts of the world I kind of wondered how they would have developed further if it wasn't for European intervention. Like, I think of America, the American continent, right? By comparison from, like, Europe, the Middle East, Central Asia, even Asia, like, that region developed really quick in human history. And by other places like the American continent, we're super slow in a lot of developments. I mean, mainly I guess the war front, but like you kind of have like the great um powers that were emerging. The first few ones in the American continent, like the Aztecs, the Inca, you know what I mean? So there was a development. Sure, they were like way behind the other continents in some ways, but like there was development. But then the European power showed up and changed everything. I'm kind of wondering how Africa would have gone if like, or even South Africa alone, if like outside powers hadn't interfered, because it does seem like they were kind of already making those first steps, like with the Zulus and their innovations of war. So I don't know. That's something I always kind of wondered. Like, but either way, yeah, the Zulu Empire really it's really cool to see um and have a better insight into exactly what made them so formidable. Essentially, changing the rules as they were of war, creating an empire as we know it, changing the face of war, and having to just kind of navigate in a world where these bigger outside powers like the British are showing up. It's almost tragic, though I know the Zulus are no saints themselves. They were brutal in their own way, but yeah, I guess it's conflicts like this that's kind of show that there's gray, a lot more gray than black and white, and yeah, the scramble for Africa, I think is what it's called. It's a very interesting event in world history. It's one that I've touched on, or have learned about rather, through classes I've taken in the past, like history classes, though I am kind of more interested in kind of learning more about it, because obviously we know that, especially like the 19th century, 18th century, around there, yeah, the great powers just kept carving this continent up. Like, my goodness, by the end, like, very few were independent, like Ethiopia, so I don't know. It's definitely, I've been meaning to touch more on African history, and I'm kind of happy that I feel like the Zulu stuff is a great. Well, I have touched a little bit on Africa in the past, but this is another bigger step into finally learning a bit more about this continent, which, when I think of, I know very little about. So yeah, hopefully more African content to come soon. So I'll end the video right here. Overall, another epic, or rather extra, series. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye, everyone.